Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. Relationships, they can be tough sometimes. And today, we're going to explore that whole idea of restoring broken relationships.
Oh, yeah.
But, and here's the twist, we're going to be looking at it through a spiritual lens.
Always interesting. What have we got to work with today?
Well, we're diving into a podcast episode called Restoring Broken Relationships, A Journey of Faith, Forgiveness, and Renewal.
Okay, so right off the bat, faith and forgiveness, huh? I'm intrigued.
Me too. It's packed with insights, let me tell you.
All right, lead the way. I'm ready.
Okay, so they start with this idea that we're all wired for connection. Like, it's in our DNA. They even go back to Genesis 2.18, it is not good for man to be alone.
Yeah, I remember that verse.
So, what are your thoughts on that? Like, how important do you think those relationships are for us?
I think it's huge. We all need those connections to thrive, to grow. Think about it. Have you ever felt completely isolated?
Oh, yeah, definitely. It's not a good feeling at all. It's almost like...
It's like a part of you is missing, right?
Exactly. And that's where I think this whole idea of restoration becomes so important.
Oh, absolutely. It's about recognizing those broken connections and finding ways to rebuild. And what I found really interesting about this podcast is that they connect it directly to this idea of willingness. Like, it all starts with a willing heart. They even quote Isaiah 1.19, which talks about experiencing the best produce of the land, if we're willing.
The best produce. What do you think they mean by that?
I think they're talking about those blessings that come with restored relationships, that feeling of peace, that sense of belonging.
Yeah, okay, I see that. But it doesn't just magically appear, does it?
Right. It takes effort. And a big part of that, as this podcast points out, is forgiveness. They bring up Colossians 3.13, forgive as Christ forgave you.
Yeah, that's a tough one, isn't it? Forgiveness?
It can be. But what really resonated with me was this phrase they used, allow God's grace to transform both our hearts and our relationships. Like, wow, that's powerful.
It is. It's like forgiveness isn't just about saying the words. It's about a much deeper internal shift.
Exactly. And letting go of that bitterness.
Because let's face it, sometimes those relationships get so broken that it's hard to imagine them ever being whole again.
Oh, I know what you mean. But that's where this idea of transformation comes in.
You think it's really possible to mend even the most shattered relationships?
That's what this podcast is saying. They talk about God's gift of reconciliation.
So it's not just about human effort. There's something bigger at play.
Exactly. And you know what? They actually share this powerful prayer for restoration in the episode. It's beautiful.
Like we're being invited to partner with something beyond ourselves.
And to believe that even when things seem impossible, there's always hope.
Hope. That's a good word. And it's something we could all use a little more of. But what does it look like in practice? How do we actually go about rebuilding those broken bridges?
Well, the podcast gives some really tangible steps, things like prayer, humility, and love.
Those are good starting points for sure. But I'm curious to hear more, like how do those things actually play out in the real world?
Yeah, let's get into that. I think that's where it gets really interesting. But maybe we should save that for our next segment.
You got it. We'll be right back after a quick break.
So, picking up where we left off, those real-world examples?
Yeah, I'm ready to dive in.
Well, the podcast actually starts getting into some really cool biblical insights that can help.
Yeah.
One that really stood out to me was about gentleness in communication. Proverbs 15.1, a gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger.
Oh, I love that verse. It's so true, right? Like, have you ever noticed how just changing your tone can totally change the whole dynamic of a conversation?
All the time. It's like choosing to build a bridge instead of like throwing gasoline on a fire,
Yeah, that's a great analogy. But it's not always easy, is it? To stay calm and gentle when you're feeling hurt or angry.
Oh, definitely not. It takes practice, And honestly, I think that's where the spiritual part comes in. It's about asking for guidance, tapping into a source of strength that's bigger than ourselves.
And that brings me to another thing they talked about that I found really interesting. Love covering wrongs.
Oh, yeah. They quote 1 Peter 4.8 on that one. It says, above all, love each other deeply because love covers over a multitude of sins.
A multitude of sins. That's powerful. Yeah. But what does that actually mean?
Well, I don't think it means just ignoring the wrongs or pretending they didn't happen. It's more about choosing to focus on that potential for healing,
Like love creates this space where forgiveness can actually take root.
Exactly. And it doesn't condone the behavior, but it recognizes that people can change, that relationships can be redeemed.
I love that. Redemption. That's a beautiful word.
Yeah.
And that's where I think the role of the Holy Spirit comes in, right? They talk about praying for love where there's hurt and peace where there's discord.
Yeah, it's like we're not in this alone. There's this incredible power that we can tap into, to guide us and to give us strength when we feel like we're falling apart.
But honestly, it's hard sometimes, isn't it? To keep believing when you're in the middle of a really tough situation.
No, it absolutely is. Especially when we're so used to instant gratification. We want those quick fixes. But sometimes healing takes time.
And patience.
Yeah, lots of patience and faith. It's about surrendering to the process, trusting that even when we can't see the outcome, there's something bigger at work.
So even when it feels like everything's falling apart, we can still hold on to hope.
That's the message, yeah. That with God, all things are possible. Even restoring those relationships that seem completely broken.
And that's a pretty radical idea.
It is, but think about it. How many times have we seen those impossible situations turn around? Hearts being mended, connections being rebuilt. It happens.
It does happen.
Yeah.
And it all starts with that willingness to take a step, right?
Yeah.
No matter how small. To reach out, to apologize, to just listen with an open heart.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And to believe that even when things seem hopeless, there's always a chance for a new beginning.
I love that. A new beginning. And speaking of new beginnings, I think it's time for us to take a quick break. We'll be right back with more of the deep dive. And we are back. It's amazing, just thinking about how broken relationships can actually be mended. I mean, with God, nothing's impossible, right?
Right. And I think that's the biggest takeaway from this whole episode for me. This idea that no matter how messy things get, there's always hope.
Hope. It's a powerful thing.
It's not passive, right? It's not just sitting around and waiting for a miracle.
Exactly. It's about taking action, partnering with God in that process of restoration, and having faith, even when you can't see the whole path ahead.
They ask a really thought-provoking question towards the end of this podcast. They say, what's one small step you can take today towards mending a broken relationship in your own life?
Such a good question, isn't it? It's like, okay, we've talked about all this stuff, but what can we actually do?
Right. Like rubber meets the road kind of thing. Exactly. And I think sometimes it really is about those small steps. Sending a text message, making a phone call, just offering a sincere apology.
Sometimes that's all it takes to start that process of healing.
And even if the other person isn't receptive right away, just the act of reaching out can be so powerful. It can help us to let go of some of that baggage we've been carrying.
Oh, absolutely. It's like we're taking responsibility for our part, and that in itself can be incredibly freeing.
Yeah. And as we start to embody those principles of forgiveness and humility, our whole perspective changes. It's like we start to see things differently. And that can have this ripple effect on all of our relationships, not just the one we're trying to mend.
So as we wrap up this deep dive,
Yeah.
what are some final thoughts you want to leave our listeners with?
Well, I just want to reiterate this idea that restoration is possible. It may not be easy, it may take time, but with God's help, those broken relationships can be mended.
And it all starts with that willingness to take a step and to believe that even in the midst of the brokenness, there's always hope.
Beautifully said.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. And as always, we'll see you next time.